All right. Well, this morning we continue 1 Samuel chapter 29 to the beginning of chapter 30. And the title of the message is Know Where to Go, Know Where to Go, K-N-O-W, Where to Go. But it's kind of a play on words. When you know where to go, you got to know where to go. You know what I mean? Anyway, when I was in high school, I was a middle distance runner. And so I liked to run the quarter mile, the half mile. Those were really my races. And when I joined the track team, the coach said, if you run the half mile, then you have to run in practice with the distance team, not the sprinters, even though you're kind of in between. And so I started running with the distance crew. And on shorter distances, I was kind of competing neck and neck with the guy who was the top guy in our school. But on longer distances, like 7-8 mile practices, I was second by a long shot, both in front and behind. I mean, this guy, he could really run. And in order to get in these 7 or 8 miles, they had all these different tracks that we would run throughout the city, and they all had a name. So they had like one that was called the Weir Run. So you can imagine that goes up Weir Road, that big tall hill, or Riggert Run, or one was called Pheasant, or one was called the Nature Run. And all these guys on the team, I was new to town, all these guys on the team knew exactly where to go on these particular practice runs. And so they would know the turns in the streets. And when the coach would say, okay, who doesn't know that? And then you raise your hand, he would tell you which streets to go down and where, in the event that you took a wrong turn. Now, for me, I was in a predicament because the first guy on longer runs would always get out in front. And normally I could stay just close enough to where I could see if he made a left or a right or went straight. But one particular practice, he had got out ahead and I didn't see the people behind me either. And I came to the fork in the road. There were many avenues that I could have gone, and I took my best guess on which way to go. And lo and behold, I wouldn't find out for about another 45 minutes to an hour that I had taken the wrong path. And when I went on that wrong path, I ended up running many miles more than the others, getting off course. And it wasn't until I went through a series of streets and I finally found that street that we all know called TV Highway, Tualatin Valley Highway, where I said, okay, I know TV Highway, and I can make it back to the school from TV Highway. In fact, I was closer to home when I realized I was at TV Highway. I might as well have just gone home at that point. But I made it all the way back to school, and everyone was waiting for me. Where'd you go? What happened? I had lost my course. I lost my course, and then rather than waiting for someone to come up or look for a checkpoint, I just made the decision to take a certain turn. Well, David is in a situation and chapters and season in his life where he's done that multiple times. He's kind of decided that there was only one way to go, one way to turn, and rather than waiting on the Lord, or he sought himself, we learn in chapter 27. And we looked at David's story in chapter 27. And then in chapter 28, we turned to look at Saul. And really, this is winding down on the book of 1 Samuel, and there's this back and forth between David and Saul. David's going to be the next king. Saul's the current king. You see things really unraveling in Saul's life, and in some ways, in many ways, even though he's a great hero in the scripture, we see some things coming undone in David's life as well. Decisions that were surprised that he made, turns that were surprised that he took. Wrong turns, and he would find himself at the lowest of lows in his life. But here in chapter 30, with no one around and everyone kind of moving on from him, he turns back to God. He knows where to go. And as we study these circumstances in David's life, I pray that God would show us, would show you today that despite wrong turns you may have taken in your life, God wants you to know where to go when you've gone farther away from him than you ever thought you would or could. That you can turn back to him and you can know that he's the place that you can go. And he will receive you back to himself, and that he can work even the lowest of lows in our lives for his glory and for his good. Amen? So let's read. We're going to read 1 Samuel 29. It's a good section of scripture. 29, we'll go all the way into chapter 30, verse 6, and then we'll take it section by section. Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, while the Israelites were camping by the spring which is in Jezreel. And the governors of the Philistines were proceeding on, leading hundreds and thousands, and David and his men were proceeding in the back with Achish. Then the commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who's been with me these days, or rather these years, and I have found nothing suspicious in him since the day he deserted to me this day?" But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Make the man go back, so he will return to his place where you have assigned him, and do not let him go to battle with us. Or in the battle he may become an adversary to us. For how could this man find favor with the Lord? Would it not be with the heads of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sing in the dances, saying, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s.'" Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest, and your going out and your coming in with me in the army are pleasing in my sight, for I have not found evil in you since the day of your coming. Nevertheless, you are not pleasing in the sight of the governors. Now then, return and go in peace, so that you will not do anything wrong in the sight of the governors of the Philistines." However, David said to Achish, "What have I done? And what have you found in your servant since the day I came before you to this day, that I cannot go fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" But Achish replied to David, "I know that you are pleasing in my sight, like an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, 'He must not go up with us to battle.' Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who have come with you. And as soon as you have risen early in the morning and have light, leave." And so David got up early, he and his men, to leave in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel. I'm going to stop there at the end of chapter 29. In chapter 30, we'll see the story continue, landing in a good way where David will ultimately strengthen himself in the Lord. But at the start of chapter 29, we start back at that way prior to working our way forward. And it's in the beginning of chapter 29 that we see David and his men marching with the Philistines. He's amongst the group that's marching, and what they're doing is they are headed for battle against God's people, David's people, the Israelites. He's marching with the ungodly, and he's ready, and he seems willing and able to fight against God's people. He's in step with the enemy. He has crossed over to the other side, and now he's fighting with them. And this is important for us to see in our lives, because I've noted as we've been in this study of the Old Testament that oftentimes it's the physical realities of the Old Testament that are the spiritual realities for the New Testament believer. That we can cross over, that we can get lost, that we can take wrong turns and end up going against the very things of God in our lives. In the scriptures, the spiritual walk that we are on is often referred to as a battle. It's a battle that we're in. 1 Timothy 6:12, Paul gives these words to Timothy. He says, "Fight the good fight of faith." In 2 Timothy 4:7, some of his final words to Timothy, he says, "Timothy, I have fought the good fight of faith." In 1 Corinthians 9:26, he told the church that he doesn't fight like one who's swinging against air. In other words, there is a real battle going on. There is a real enemy. In 1 Peter 5:8, we know that the enemy prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. There's a real war. There's a real battle. We may not always see it with our eyes physically, but spiritually, it is always happening. It's early. It's often. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Paul says we're to stand what? Firm. We're to stand firm because there's a real battle going on. In other words, the spiritual battle lines have been drawn up, and the Lord wants us to make sure that we are on the right side. And when I say the right side, that means his side in every situation. But the situations and circumstances that we come up against are often complex, aren't they? And we can become conflicted, and we can become thrown off course, or even committed to contending for the things that are against God. But that should never be the case for you and for me. How does it all start in our lives? Sometimes it starts slow. Sometimes it wells up rapidly. For David, it began with a false belief in his life. A false belief that the enemy was going to take him out, and then came compromise. And what we're going to look at is the compromise in his life, and ultimately the place he lands, turning back to the Lord. And so I want to look at three particular points this morning as we continue forward that will provide direction for us to know where to go. The first is what is important to see, where to set your focus, and where to find strength as you proceed forward. The first one is what to see. And I want you to see that there's calamity in compromise. There's calamity in compromise. We read in verses 1-3 that the Philistines, they're gathered together, all the armies to Aphek, and the Israelites, they're camping out, and the governors and the Philistines, they're proceeding on. There's hundreds, there's thousands going into battle, and David is here marching with the enemy, but it says David and his men are at the back with Achish. David had become, we saw in previous chapters, David had become the bodyguard of the king. That's a promotion. If you're in some kind of security business, if you're guarding the head honcho, the top dog, you're pretty good, right? Like, you're the one who's, at least you hope, you're the one to guard that person. That means you're to be the best of the best. David has gotten a promotion in the enemy army. And the king of the enemy really likes him. He said that David would be his bodyguard for life, chapter 28. And he said to David in chapter 28 that he was going to go to war with him. He says, David, you've lived in our land for a while. You're going to go to war with us against your own people. And what did David say? He said, very well, you'll see what your servant can do out there on the battlefield. And as everyone marches along, everyone's marching, the leaders of the Philistines, the Philistine governors, see David and his men back there, and they go, what are these guys doing here? What are these Hebrews doing with us going against the Hebrews? I think that's a very good question. It's a question that David should have asked himself. What am I doing here? Marching with these Philistines. What are these Hebrews doing here? But it seems that for the last 16 months, David has become blind to the fact that he does not belong there. That is not the place for him. How did he end up there? How did he end up marching with the enemies of God? How did he end up there? Well, compromise. F.B. Meyer, in his commentary, wrote about David and the Philistines. And what he wrote was that the Philistines are a biblical representation of the world and worldliness, and David is a representation of the church. It's like the church has crossed over and is not just, in the world, they've become of the world. And they're marching with the world, and they're contending for the things of the world, not the things of God's people. He's turned, and the whole thing started with compromise. And we've looked at the story, but if this is your first Sunday here, I just like to give the backstory because I think context is really cool in Scripture. Like, how did he get here? Well, David was just this young shepherd boy. And he gets called up to be the next king because King Saul had turned against God. He was disobedient to God. And so Samuel ends up getting anointed as king. And so he's set apart for that, but Saul's still in that seat. And David starts to serve Saul in various ways, playing music for him, serving him in battle. And Saul becomes very jealous, envious of David. And as that envy wells up, that jealousy wells up, finally, Saul begins to make David his enemy. And David becomes public enemy number one. The best armies in all the land are seeking David to end his life. And David, throughout that process and throughout that time, it was over a decade in his life, had opportunities to kill Saul, to end Saul's life, but he didn't do it. He goes, my hand will not be against him here. Yet still, the very next chapter, you see they're back after him. And so David finally, chapter 27, it says, he said to himself, he sought himself, he looked inward, and what did he say is, now I'm going to perish by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than to escape into the land of the Philistines. And Saul will despair of searching for me. I'll escape from his hand. And we looked at that when we were in chapter 27 of how David, in that moment, in his despair, he sought self and not the Lord. He said, there's nothing better for me than to go over into enemy territory. And he began listening to himself rather than listening to the Lord. But had he listened to the Lord, he would have realized that he was not going to die by the hand of Saul because he had promise after promise after promise that he was going to be the next king. Was he king yet? No, he was not king yet. How could he die at the hand of Saul if Saul would not be king one day? David would be king. He would be appointed as ruler over the people. And again, Saul's own son tells him this. Abigail tells him this. Samuel the prophet tells him this. But here he is going into Philistine territory, and the place that he went, we saw in chapter 28 or chapter 27 is Gath. Now Gath, he has a history there in Gath. Whether you've been here on Sundays or not, you maybe know the story or have heard the story of David and Goliath. Gath was Goliath's hometown, and David had gone there before. He went there before, and as soon as he came in, he comes in with Goliath's sword, and they see him come in, and they're like, that's David. And I'm sure people are like, and that's Goliath's sword. What do? They seize him immediately. And what does he do? He starts acting crazy. He feigns madness. He starts drooling. He starts scribbling all over things. And the king Achish, he's like, I don't need any more crazy people. Get him out of here. So he leaves, and we're like, yes, he got out of Gath. You know, the Lord spared him from Gath. Now what happens? He's in this place. He goes, I'm going back to Gath. I'm going back to that place where I was crazy. I'm going back to that enemy territory. I'm going back to that place where there's a target on me. And now it says that he lives there. And when he lives there, he's assigned a territory there in Ziklag, which guess what the name Ziklag means? Winding road. He settles down on that winding road. That road with many turns, and he's taken the wrong turn. And this time, instead of pleading insanity, he immediately begins compromising. He immediately kind of steps foot into the enemy territory. Oh, you know, I'm not like that. David, verse 2, it says he set out and crossed over. Verse 5, it says he sought favor from the Philistine king. He wanted the favor of the enemy. Then he referred to himself as a servant of the king. Then he lies to the king in order to gain favor. He says he was out attacking the Israelites, but he wasn't. And the king's like, oh yeah, now I really got him. So he's lying. Then he tells the king he's willing to fight against God's people. Now he's on his way to fight against God's people. Do you see how this situation has gone from bad to worse? He's not just thinking about it. He's not just talking about it. He's walking. He's walking, and it seems like he's all about it. What are these Hebrews doing here? David, what are you doing here? Good question. So Achish said to the commanders, this is David. He says he's been here months, years. He hadn't been there years, but he had been there over a year. He says of all the time he's been here, he's been just this great servant to me. He's like an angel of God to me. I mean, he wasn't an angel while he was out there. Like, that's real. But he calls him that. But I want to catch this, that it says the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And they said, make him go back. Make him go back to the place that you've assigned him. He cannot go to battle with us. For how could this man find favor with the Lord? Would it not be with the heads of these men? In other words, he goes, we know who David is, okay? Isn't he the one that they sang that song about? You know when that song came out, that song was written? It was after David killed Goliath. And the Israelites started singing, I don't know the tune. We can make it up all we want. David slain his, I don't know, whatever, like, or Saul slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. They made up this song about him. It was a #1 hit. It was very popular in the land. And they're going, that's the guy who killed our hero. That's the guy who killed our giant Goliath. Like that's him. And how do you know he's not out here like trying to serve his God? And what would bring pleasure more than taking our heads off? We can't go to battle with this guy. In other words, he doesn't belong here. He does not belong here. I'm glad they realized it. They remind of this song. It was this song that was sung. Now, it was a song. Catch this. This song, I don't know if David liked it or not. Maybe he didn't. Why? Because it was this song that made Saul angry with him. It set off this time in his life where Saul was jealous of him and he would be on the run from Saul. Okay? It was a song that God had been using in David's life to show who he was, that he would be the next king. Now it's a song that the Philistines are using in David's life to say, get out of here. You don't belong here. You can't fight with us. Like, this song is being used here in his life. But here's the reality. God was using this song to rescue David. To rescue David from this potentially disastrous situation where he might end up regretting. And sometimes in our lives as well, we can think, you know what? I'm so sick of that. David could be like, I'm so sick of that song. Stop singing it. It hasn't done me any good, but it's doing him a lot of good. It's doing him a ton of good. He could think, this song is ruining my opportunities. This song turned Saul against me. This song is causing me to no longer live peaceably here in this place where I haven't had all these problems or needing to hide out in caves. But here's the reality. It was a song God was using all along because if nothing changed, David's compromise was going to turn into great calamity. Look, could it be the things in our life that God, as the master composer and awesome orchestrator, is using in our lives to say, you know what, you might not like that song right now, but I'm using it to do exceedingly abundantly far beyond what you think. I'm using it in your life to work all things together for good. The Lord was using this again in David's life to get him out of that place. He could have thought, because of this song, people won't accept me. But God was rescuing him. David's compromise, if God did not intervene, was going to lead to calamity. And in reality, it would be better if David had stayed in the cave than to go into this season of compromise. I told a few weeks ago, we talked about getting out of the cave. Well, don't go from the cave to compromise. Go from the cave to Christ. pursue Christ. That word compromise has several different meanings. One definition is an intermediate between different things. It's also referred to as a dangerous place where one's reputation is exposed to danger and suspicion. This compromised position. Your character, your integrity, it's up for question. It's compromised. Calamity is affliction, adversity, disaster. Compromise can lead to calamity. And that calamity word is a word in Scripture as well. It's Deuteronomy 32. It's part of a song that Moses uses to depict God's people as children who had forsaken and turned against their father. They had been faithful in the past, but they had turned toward evil. They had compromised, and that would cause their foot to slip in due time. In other words, Moses is saying, you don't see it right now, but your foot's going to slip in due time if you don't turn, if you don't come back. It was not just a warning, but it was real in Deuteronomy, and it's real for us as well. Psalm 1:1, blessed is the person who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. Psalm 1:1, when I read Psalm 1:1 and I think of compromise, I think of that. You know, you're walking in the counsel of the wicked, you're standing with sinners, you're sitting with scoffers. And I often think of the story of Peter. On the night when Jesus was betrayed at the Last Supper, what did he say? You're all going to fall away because of me. Well, what did Peter say? Not I. Not me, never. I would never do that. Even if I have to die, I would not deny you. But as the story went on, what do we see? We see Jesus going, getting arrested and walking. We see Peter walking at a distance. It says he's following at a distance. That's the path. That's what the wicked do. They're distant from God. They're far from God. So we see him do that. Then we see him standing in the way of sinners. We see him, they say to him, you're not one of his disciples, are you? You are. You're one of his disciples, are you? And what does he say? Nope, I'm not one of them. I don't know what you're talking about. And then, sitting in the company of scoffers, it says Peter sat down at the fire. And someone says, didn't I see you in the garden cutting off someone's ear? They didn't say all that, but they just said, didn't I see you in the garden? But like, I'm just having a little fun here. Like, didn't I see you cutting off the high priest's servant's ear there in the garden? Like, wasn't that you? And then they say, you're definitely one of them. They say, you even talk like one of them. Like the way you talk, you sound like one of his disciples. And what did Peter do? He's like, how about now? Cuss, cuss, cuss. How do I sound now? And he starts cussing and swearing. And just then what happens? The rooster crows. The rooster crows. Peter was told what would happen, but he still didn't see it coming. And church, we've been told what would happen, but sometimes we still don't see it coming. God has given us the recipe. He's given us the answers in his book. And we go, well, why am I experiencing this? God has said, he has told us what would happen. Now, I personally, in my own life, in my own family, in my own upbringing, saw the disaster, the calamity that comes from compromise. I mean, again and again. There were all kinds of things happening. And it was terrible. And the enemy wanted to steal, and he wanted to kill, and he wanted to destroy. And there were affairs and stepping out and breakups and shakeups and makeups and more of the same. It was happening again and again and again. Why? Because sin is crouching at the door. And it's saying just a little bit more, just one step, just one more drink. Just one more night out. Just one more phone call to that person. Oh, it's not that big of a deal. Just do that just for a little bit. You know, you ever hear this? Someone say, well, I know my limits. You know, I know when to stop. I know when to hold them and I know when to fold them. Okay, no you don't. You should have folded them a long time ago. Sin is crouching at the door. It's a lion. It's seeking to devour. And calamity comes from that compromise. Last year, I went and I got to teach at the 10th Hour Project. It's this group of young adults who are learning the Bible. And while we were down there, we drove from Albuquerque to Las Cruces. And that's about a 3-hour drive. And on the way down, it was so funny. On the way down, we see this, you know how it says a city's coming up? You know, it said 30 miles and then the city. And the city's name was Truth or Consequences. Now, I guess it got named after some game show, but I was like, wow. Like, it says 30 miles to Truth or Consequences. And then, well, my first thought was like, wow, this must be more like, this must have more spiritual rootedness down here than I thought. Like, they're not playing around down here in New Mexico. But as we get closer, what does it say? Then it's like 22 miles to Truth or Consequences, 15 miles to Truth or Consequences, 2 miles to Truth or Consequences. And the reality in our life is that that's true for us, even if we don't see the road sign as we walk down the road. If we don't turn to the truth, if we don't turn to the Lord, the reality is that there's going to be consequences. Jesus has told us this. He has written this. Proverbs 13 says, the way of the transgressor is hard. The transgressor is one who crosses over to the other side. And for that one, they need to turn back to truth, back to God, or consequences. Again, perhaps this morning you're saying, oh, I can just push the limit. I can just live over here in this land and, I'll know when to stop. And we have these self-limitations that we put on ourselves. But the fact of the matter is again and again, we do not set the right limits. We just don't. We don't recognize how far in we are. In compromise, we don't see clearly. And the Philistine leaders here in verse 4, they told their king that they should send David back. They said, send him back to the place you've assigned. In other words, they're saying, David doesn't belong here, but we don't want him to go back to Israel either. Just let him go out there in the wilderness area, out in the outskirts. Let him get lost. He doesn't belong over here. He doesn't belong over there. But I like that. The king of the Philistines had assigned something for David. And I need you to know this, that just as God has plans for you, plans to prosper you, plans for a hope and a future, the enemy, Satan, has plans to kill you, to steal you, and to destroy your life. He has plans too. There's a real battle going on. And we can't begin to step foot over here in this land of compromise and think that we will not be consumed. The enemy prowls around like a roaring lion. And what does he want to do? He wants to devour you. You remember when Jesus told Peter, he says, Simon, that was another name for Peter, the enemy has asked to sift you like wheat. He wants to sift you and I like wheat too. That means to shake you apart, to break you down, to steal, kill, and destroy. And it's the moment that we begin to think that that's not true. It's the moment that we begin to think, oh, I'll just hang out for a while over here, I'll hold them for a while until I fold them. I can recognize the road signs. I know when I'm there at the time of consequence, that we begin to deceive ourselves. My dad, he was talking about our family, the situation, and he goes, Samuel, it's like you open the door and there's this lion there. And the lion just kind of reaches out his paw and he's like, oh, that's kind of cool, like gentle beast, like just, and so you're like, oh, it's kind of cool, this lion. Like I'm going to I'll let the foot in and then it's cold at night and you let, part of the body in. And he said, over time, all of a sudden you realize that there's a lion that you've welcomed into your home and that lion has torn everything apart. Psalm 119:1, joyful are the people of integrity who follow the instruction of the Lord. Joyful are those who obey his laws and search for him with their hearts. They do not compromise with evil, and they only walk in his paths. You have charged us to keep your commandments carefully. Oh, that my actions would consistently reflect your decrees. Then I will not be ashamed when I compare my life with your commands. As I learn your righteous regulations, I will thank you by living as I should. Wow. When I walk in him, I live as I should. Enemy territory was no place for David, but here's the reality. God was not giving up, and God does not give up on you and I either. And 2 Timothy 2, if we are faithless, he remains faithful. And we're going to see that. Here's the next point. You got to know where to go. Set your focus on being pleasing in his sight. It says, Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives, you have been honest and you're going out and you're coming in. Your army's pleasing in my sight. I've found no evil since the day of your coming to me. Nevertheless, you're not pleasing in the sight of the governors. So they tell Achish to send him along. Achish thought he had been honest. But catch this. He says, David, you've been pleasing in my sight, but you're not pleasing in their sight. And so you don't belong, so you can't stay here. They had an interesting type of government by vote. And David attempts to defend himself. What have you found wrong with me that I can't go fight against the enemies of my Lord the King? Now, some people, when David says this, some commentators believe that when David said this, he may have actually been planning to go against the Philistines while they were out there, because he called Saul at another time his Lord the King. But interesting, he also calls Achish his Lord. So that's the point of compromise. You just don't know. It's like, where are you at? I don't know, man. I don't know where you're at. You're not in and you're not out. You're in this place where there's question to his integrity, and it's hard to see. But what he's told is you need to rise up early in the morning. And so he got up early, and they went back to that place. They headed back to Ziklag, and he's in this place here. But what he's finding is that his Philistine friends are no friends at all. He had no home, so to speak. His focus was on being pleasing at first in Saul's sight. Then he set his sights on being pleasing in the sight of the enemy, but neither was working. And he's trying to please all of these different groups. He's trying to fit in. He's trying to find his place there. Be pleasing in their sight. When I grew up, I know what trying to fit in is like. I don't know, maybe one of you can beat me, but 10 years, 10 different schools till 10th grade. Okay, that's a lot. So what am I trying to do every new year when I go to a new place? I'm trying to fit in. I'm trying to man, everyone needs a friend, right? You want to be where everyone knows your name and no one knows my name. And, so what do you start to do? You're like, people will be like, hey man, are you into Pokemon? Like, no, I'm not into Pokemon, but I guess maybe today, I just need a friend, Pokemon wasn't even a thing back then, by the way. What did they have back then? They had these Pogs or something, these little, I forgot all about them until right now. But hey man, you got a Pog collection? Like, no, I have a basketball card collection, but what did I do? I went and got some Pogs, hey, yeah, I'm into Pogs. Look at this Pog I got, this is cool. And there's things that you're really not into, that you're really not about, but what are you? You don't have a home. These people don't know you, and so you're trying to find a way to fit in, find a way to make friends. You're moving around so much, you kind of have to blend in. But the reality is you are not home. You're not home, and you're not at home. I remember being at this party in middle school, and I show up to this friend's birthday party, and my dad drops me off. You don't have cell phones back then. And they're like, yeah, we're going to watch a horror movie. I didn't like horror movies. I still don't. And they're like, do you like horror movies? I'm like, oh, yeah, man. They're like, what's the last one you watched? Like, I don't know, Wizard of Oz? That was about as horrific as it got for me. Like, that witch haunted me, man. But then they start showing this thing, and I'm like, oh, like, see no evil, like, this is crazy. I can't believe that I'm over here. Why did I do that? Why did I go there? Why did I say that? Why am I trying to be pleasing in their sight? And look, that's true for you and I too. We live in this life and it's like, oh, I want to be accepted. I want to be promoted. I want to be befriended. I don't want this friend to block me on Facebook or something like that. And so I'm going to do whatever I can do to be pleasing in their sight. But what is it? It's compromise, compromise, compromise. And the reality is that that posture simply isn't right. And it's so interesting how people can change their positions and make decisions along party lines and along these relational lines. But the reality is God has set the standard. And the most important thing for you and for me is to be pleasing in his sight. To be good and pleasing in his sight. 2 Corinthians 5:6, therefore, being always of good cheer, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. But we are of good courage and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be home with the Lord. Therefore, we have as our ambition, whether home or absent, to be what? Pleasing to him. When it says home or absent, that's saying like with the Lord or here. Home is with him. We're headed towards home. So sometimes you might feel, man, I don't really feel at home here. Well, guess what? You're not. We're citizens of heaven. And it's our heavenly citizenship that should inform our U.S. citizenship. It should inform the way that we live. C.S. Lewis once wrote, aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you will get neither. What is it? What is it that you are seeking to be pleasing? In whose sight? Is it money or popularity or status or favor with your friend group? And you might say, someone could say, well, Jesus grew in favor with God and men. Like, why can't I have it both ways? Okay, maybe you can, but it's got to be on God's terms. You see, here's the thing. Jesus, did he hang out with tax collectors and sinners? Yes. Let me ask you this. When Jesus hung out with tax collectors and sinners, was he tax collecting? Was he sinning? No. When Jesus spoke to prostitutes, was he out there engaged in it? No. In other words, they met Jesus and it was on his terms. He was righteous. He didn't, I'm going to go over here so that I can win one. That is a lie. That you have to go engage in this or engage in that in order to win someone from there. I don't believe that that's true at all. And Jesus prayed that while we're in the world, we're to be kept from the world. And what is it that keeps us from the world? The truth. He says, your word, Lord, is truth. It's sometimes difficult to see David in this particular place. He's a man after God's own heart, yet he's going after all of these other hearts. But here's the thing, I believe the Lord was using it to bring him back, to show him where home is. And you could go, how could David do that? Look no further than you and I. Because we've been there, done that, got the t-shirt, and had to realize that heaven is where home is. That God is where home is. When you set your sights on pleasing others, they will reject you depending on what you've done. But when you set your sights on God, he restores you despite what you've done. That's home. Here's the last point. Turn again to finding your strength in him. Turn again to finding your strength in him. That's the place to go. I want to paraphrase verses 1-5 of chapter 30. Upon being told that he and his men didn't belong with the enemy, David and his men headed back to the place they had been assigned. What was that? Windy road, Ziklag. They go back to windy road territory. And when they come back, it was a 3-day journey. And when they come back, here's what they see. Everything had been burnt to the ground. The whole city had been burnt to the ground. Everyone there had been seized and taken. by the Amalekites, another enemy. Their women, their wives, their children, everyone was gone. There was nothing there. And here's what happens. Verse 4, David and his people who were with him raised their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. They wept until there was nothing left. And then guess what happens? David's men, verse 6, it says, David was in great distress because the people spoke of stoning him. All the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and daughters. They thought about their sons, they thought about their wives, they thought about their daughters, they thought about their children, that everyone was gone. And here's David. Catch this. Saul is against him. The Israelites, enemy number one. Philistines have turned on him, rejected him. Now guess what? His mighty men are ready to stone him. You think he's in a lonely place? He was at the lowest of lows. David had gotten them into this mess, and now they want to remove him. They want him gone. And I just want to speak to you this morning as we close. Perhaps that's you this morning. You've tried everything you can. You've been looking for acceptance. You've been looking for love. You've been looking for these things in all the wrong places. Perhaps you've tried to find a home amongst God's people, and for one reason or another, it didn't work out. And so you went over to enemy territory, and this morning you're realizing this isn't working out. This is just not right. And perhaps you have felt like you've lost. Perhaps you're searching. Perhaps things have burnt to the ground. Perhaps the enemy has taken more than his fair share of the good things in your life. And you're coming back and you're looking at that land like David did. Everything burnt to the ground. Everyone gone. But it was in that place at that time, and I need you to hear this. It was at that place and at that time where David knew where to go. He turned to God. He said, everyone's left me. Everyone's turned their back on me. I've tried to, bat for the other team or whatever. That didn't work. Even my own men who I've been faithful to, that's not working. He turned to God. It says, verse 6, he strengthened himself in the Lord. And I want to tell you this, in chapter 30, the rest of this chapter is going to look much different than the previous few in David's life. When he strengthens himself in the Lord, he's at the lowest point in his life. He's out in this burnt down wilderness, but I want to tell you this, God was going to use David's extremity as his opportunity. And I hope and I pray that God would use your extremity today, if you're in that place, as his opportunity for you to come back, to find your strength in him and know that he is where home is. To be pleasing in his sight, and it doesn't take much, because I was reminded of another distant land, of a young man who went and took all that his father had given him. It's called the prodigal son. And he spent it on loose living. And it says he goes into a distant land and he's out spending it all. And it says that as he looks at the food, that the pods that the pigs were eating, and he goes, oh, I wish I could just have some of that he realized things were way better at his father's house. And it says he came to himself. In other words, when he was out there, he was not who he was supposed to be. He was not who God wanted him to be. And he turned back. And when he turned back, the Father received him. And he had worked up this big explanation. And the father didn't even let him. He just said, go kill the fatty calf. We're throwing a party. Put a robe on him, put a ring on him, put some sandals on his feet. He's my son. And you may be out in the wilderness right now, and the enemy may be saying, oh yeah, I got you. Just stay in the place I've assigned. I want to say this morning, no more. God has his arms open to you and he's ready to receive you back. Would you just come to yourself? That is the person that God has for you to be, and say, Lord, I'm coming back. And you strengthen yourself in him. Look, I was thinking about strengthening. What would it mean spiritually to strengthen ourselves? I was just thinking the physical reality. If I want to get bigger and stronger and more strength, I load up plates on a bar and I push more weight than I could actually carry, more than for about 8 reps, right? And then someone helps it off, and then I do it again to kind of come to the end of myself. It's the weight that I can carry. But when you strengthen yourself in the Lord, you load up all the plates and you can't even lift it off of the bench. And you say, Lord, I just can't. I need you. That's how you strengthen yourself in the Lord, by giving him the weight. And I think there's some weight that he wants you to give to him today. Would you do that? David wrote that the Lord is the strength of his life. In Psalm 40, he wrote, I waited patiently for the Lord. He reached down. He heard my cry. He brought me out of the pit of destruction, out of the mud, and he set my feet on the rock, making my footsteps firm. Are you ready for the Lord to lift you up and to lift you out and to set your feet on the rock and say, this is the place that you've always belonged. I don't care where you've been. Oh, if that's you this morning, would you bow your heads and close your eyes? And I just want you in your mind's eye to see the Lord reaching out his hands. And I don't know what you've been into. I don't know what you've been looking at. I don't know what you've been desiring. But I think that right now, some of you in this place know that that's not the place that the Lord has for you. And it's time for you to go back to him, to strengthen yourself in him, and to tell him, Lord, I can't carry this. I just need you to take it. And if you're saying that to him right now, I want to remind you of his resume. Because in Matthew chapter 11, he said, if anyone is burdened and heavy laden, that they could come to him and they would find rest for their soul. God, would you give rest for the souls of those who know right now that they need you to take the weight? And if that's you, right here and right now in this place, you can just say that to him. Lord, I need you. Would you take the weight? It's too much for me. And I believe if you're saying that to him right now, that he's saying to you, absolutely. He's putting a robe on you, a ring on you, sandals on your feet. Let's have a party. Because that child who was once lost is now found. And Lord, we thank you for your grace and your mercy, your never-ending second chance. And we receive it now this morning, readily and willingly. Pour out your grace on us. Oh, we need you. In Jesus' name, amen.